Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCS 2026 off-season grades and analysis video. I'm super excited to get into this one. We just covered the LEC a couple of days ago where we went over every single roster move in that league. I kind of gave my thoughts and opinions on whether or not I thought teams were moving in the right direction, but all of the talk was around my grades, as it almost always is. It's really funny, not to do an aside for a video that isn't this one, but I do find it always very funny that most of the conversation in the comments comes from the lack of roster change. Hansama getting all the discussion in that LEC vid because I gave him a B grade. I'm very excited to see how people respond and react to my LCS grades. I continue to believe that I'm not going to be on the same page as everybody else. I've been like that the entire tenure here on YouTube. If I wasn't doing better than general consensus, I wouldn't keep going. But I'm excited for this LCS video. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. Very curious to know what your thoughts and opinions are on this LCS offseason. I'm happy to say LCS again instead of LTA North. It feels a lot more comfortable coming out of the mouth. That's just a brief detour that the league took that luckily we have recovered from. But I'm very excited to get into this video in particular because I think the LCS's offseason was just so crazy. Like, there were so many things that I did not expect to happen. This is probably the most chaotic offseason in North America in many years, at least in terms of like top teams really shuffling around. Nobody is really looking the same with the exception of one team going into 2026, and I think that that's both good and bad for the league. Do I think the overall talent level went up? Kind of. I think more teams got competitive. I think the bottom of the LCS is much stronger than it was last year, and I think that, my grades will likely reflect that, but I am a little bit worried about the top end. I don't quite know if we're going to have the same kind of, dominant team like FlyQuest was last year, and I'll talk about that as well as we go throughout this video. But let's get the preamble out of the way. There's so much to go over at the start of videos like this, so many bits and pieces of housekeeping that I just need to make sure that I address at the start of this video. First and foremost, if you don't know who I am, hello, I'm K-Man. I've been covering the LCS as well as the 4 other major regions, or the 3 other major regions here in the LEC, LCK, and LPL for 5 years in a row on this channel. Every single game, I've been doing the same for the NACL, so I have a pretty good understanding of exactly the trajectory and the overall pathway for a lot of the players that have been called up over the course of this offseason as well, but I definitely have a pretty decent knowledge repository. I basically always get comments on these videos that, oh, you clearly don't watch the games, or you clearly don't understand like what's going on, and I just find those comments very funny. I have over, 5,000 hours of content on this channel talking about all of these games, so if you want to say that my opinion is invalid because it doesn't match with yours, that's totally fine. But I do always get a little bit of a chuckle out of the comments that are like, you clearly don't watch the games, because it's very funny to me that on this channel of all channels, you're saying that I don't watch the games. But at the end of the day, people are going to have their own opinions, and that is the biggest caveat. That is the biggest piece of housekeeping that I can do at the start of this video. I promise you, under every circumstance imaginable, you are going to see something in this video that you do not like and that you do not agree with. And that's awesome. That's kind of the point of sharing opinions on the internet, is I'm going to have my opinion and you're going to have your opinion. That doesn't make either of us, infinitely more valuable than the other. I'm going to go over why my opinion, is what it is, why I have certain opinions on certain players, why I might be higher or lower than consensus on certain players, but I'd love to know where you guys end up landing on a lot of this. I asked this at the end of the previous video, but I'm not quite sure. A lot of people ended up making it there, so I'm going to say it at the beginning. Let me know in the comments your favorite grade of the video, who you think I got the most spot on, whether that's because I hit consensus or whether or not you think I took a risk on a player that you agree with, whatever. Let me know your favorite grade, and let me know your least favorite grade in a comment down in the comment section below. I'm very curious to know where you guys land on a lot of these players, but other bits of housekeeping that we are going to throw up on the screen now is the key for my grading scale that you're going to see throughout this entire video. We're going to go from A+ to C-. That's kind of how I've been doing it the past couple of years. There's obviously, a lot to talk about with this grading scale, but I want to make it very clear. If you are like 1 or 2 grades off of me, it's really not going to be that much of a difference. I still get comments all the time about how people are so mad that I have a player at B instead of at B+, or that I have a player at B- instead of B. it's really not that big of a difference. Like, I promise you guys, if you have a player at B plus and I put them at B, I would not, go out there and be like, oh my God, I can't believe he's disrespecting this player. I think that kind of undercuts the points that I'm trying to make with this video. The grading scale is more so there to emphasize the words that are coming out of my mouth and the playstyle expectations that I'm going to talk about. It's more of a visual aid and a conglomeration than anything else. If you are just here for the grades, this might not be the video. You know what I mean? So it just kind of is what it is on that front. But let me go ahead and explain what each grade means. First and foremost, I think there are 3 tiers in these grades: A, B, and C. I think if you're within one of those tiers, you're basically similar enough to anybody else in those tiers, even like a B minus to a B plus. Your A tier players are going to be the best, B are going to be solid, and C are going to be questionable, but I break them down within those tiers just to make things a little bit more apparent. Starting with A plus, this is your best of the region. This is a player that is not only the best player in the region, like as a whole, but is likely going to be able to elevate any team he's on to compete to win the entire league and to compete internationally. This is, the Caps effect, the Chovy effect, the Knight effect of a lot of those other regions. I don't quite think the LCS has the same caliber of player as those, regions do. I think there's one player that has been phenomenal, and now that he's not an import, we'll talk about him potentially being the only A+, but this is like a 1 of 1 type of grade. Last year, there was not a single A+ in the LCS or the LTA rankings when I did this video. Then you get to the A minus section. The A is going to be your superstars. These are, people who can compete at any point to be the best player in the entire league and to win MVP and to run away with things, likely the best player in their role. A minus is still elite. I get a lot of comments about players being A minus that should be A or A plus. A minus is still an MVP caliber player to me. This just means that maybe they have some inconsistencies, or maybe they haven't done it for multiple years in a row, something like that. Like, there is some sort of thing that's holding me back a little bit from feeling confident that they're definitely going to be like an A or an A plus, but an A minus player can turn into an A plus player very, very quickly if they just have one phenomenal year. So that's where the A's are. These are the best players in the region. Basically, nobody in A is going to be lower than the top 1 or top 2 in their position in the entire league. Then you start getting into the B's. This is where you start getting into your good starters, players you feel good about starting, even if, and especially if you're trying to go to Worlds. B plus is going to be consistently good starters. These are players that I would say have a relatively high floor, that I would be surprised if they were just bad going into 2026, but maybe aren't quite at that same elite level or have something that just keeps them out of that upper tier, in my opinion. The only difference between B plus and B is the consistency. B is a inconsistent good starter. This essentially just means that their highs are probably going to be about the same as a B plus player. On any given day, they can probably perform like an A minus player. You might have a couple weeks in a row where they perform really well, but I just worry about the floor. I worry about the consistency. I'm not guaranteed in my brain that they are going to perform the way that, you kind of hope that they will. There's more variance, I think, in B players than there is in B plus players, and I think that really is the only difference between those two grades, at least in my opinion, or at least with how this grade system ends up working out. And then B minus for me, this is kind of where you end off the, like, I feel good about you starting. These are your okay starters. You can probably get away with being a Worlds team if this is like the weakest player in your starting lineup. Like, if you have a B minus player and they're your 5th guy, you can probably get away with that. It's just kind of tough. These are players that I think deserve to be starting in the league, but are likely, mediocre starters, players that are going to fall somewhere between like the 4th to 6th best players in their role. They're not really going to be concerns for your team, but they're likely not going to be elevating it either. Kind of the definition of an average player at this level. And that kind of ends off the B's. And then once you start getting into the C's, these are players with massive question marks. C plus is going to be weak starters. These are players that I can understand why you're starting them in the league, because I think they either have, some interesting upside, or, have shown things in the past, maybe not last year, but in previous years, that have indicated that they at least deserve to get another shot. But these are players with like genuine serious questions about whether or not they're going to be on a team at the end of the year. These are the first players that I would expect to get kind of called if things don't work out for certain orgs and certain teams. Then once you get to C, if somebody has a C grade, that's like, I personally wouldn't be starting them. I think that they are probably not worth a starting spot in the LCS, and definitely are a concern for me going into the year for any team that ends up starting them. There are no C minus players, but if there were C minus players, these would be players that I'm confident are not starting caliber players and that I am actively upset are on the rosters. Luckily in the LCS, we don't have any of those. There was no Loopies or Abadagas lying around this year like in the LEC last year. So Hope that explains the grading scale. People continue to, I don't want to say misinterpret everything that I say here. I get that it's like a 5-minute explanation. People likely just skip around to the to the images and the graphics and then write their comments without listening to anything here. But I definitely want to try and explain the grading scale because I do think that there is a lot to talk about when it comes to these players individually. And I think getting too wrapped up in the weeds of these grades ends up kind of defeating the purpose of the entire video. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into the analysis itself. I know we're already 10 minutes here, but strap in. This is going to be a long one. These always are, you know, at least an hour. That's how it always goes here. It's a podcast. We can just kind of riff and roll, I guess. But starting off, the way that we're going to be organizing this video is the way we organize all of the other ones with these off-season grades video. We're going to go from first to last in the summer split of last year, and we're going to go over every single team's off-season. I'll be talking about whether or not I think they got better, whether they got worse, you know, how I grade each player, and what I think their expectations are going into 2026. And that means starting off with our defending summer split champions and the team that really dominated North America all year long. And boy, did they make some changes. It's FlyQuest that we are going to talk about first. This gives me a good chance to talk about what you might be seeing on your screen. Not a great chance, but an okay chance to talk about what you might be seeing on your screen. Of course, the top side of this graphic is their team from last year. The bottom side will be their team going into 2026. In the middle, you're going to have one of 4 things for each position. No change means that it's the same player from last year. You're just running it back. You can see that for Quad and Masu here. Upgrade and downgrade, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. You can kind of expect, you know, what those mean. An upgrade would mean that I think they just straight up got better in the position, and a downgrade would mean that I think they just straight up got worse in the position. There's also change, which will be denoted in yellow. That means that I think you kind of made a side grade, or maybe you downgraded in the short term to potentially upgrade in the long term. You know, they're kind of more specific cases, and we'll talk about those as we go throughout the video for the specifics of those. But for FlyQuest, they go from a team that absolutely dominated North America, dominated the LTA North through all of 2025, to a team that I think has a lot of upside. I think that is the positive here, but their floor is incredibly low, and I think that's where I get to talk about some of these players. So let's go over their roster for 2026. It's looking like Gekgos in the top lane, Griffin in the jungle, Quad in the mid lane, Masu at AD carry, and Cryogen at support. This is a very weird roster, and I don't want to say that it was wrong for Fly to do what they did, because I don't think it was. I think that, you know, there are a couple of players that they bring in here that I'm really excited about. Griffin, I'm really excited about coming to the LCS. I think he's the kind of player that can really make an impact basically day one if everything were to click for him. You know, they invested in Gekgos last year. It makes sense to promote him once Bwipo ends up leaving. That always felt like it was going to be the plan going into this year, but I'm worried about the floor of this team. I really think there's a universe where this team is just not competitive in year one, and where they kind of need to, you know, figure some things out before they actually start to stand up to some of the better teams in the LCS. But some of the positives, at least some of the more proven players, the proven players on this team, come from the retentions that this team made. Quad and Masu coming back from last year. Masu obviously was kind of a must. He's kind of the face of the franchise now. Inspired and Busio, to me, should have been that. Busio in particular. Fortunately, Busio goes over to the LEC, so FlyQuest doesn't have the chance to retain him. But Masu is now the face of the franchise here for FlyQuest, and as a homegrown, you know, player who came through the Challenger system and, you know, debuted for this team, he is everything he kind of should be as a player. Is he a little bit limited as a skill set? I'm not going to say he's like fully limited. He is a good laner, but he's certainly not known for his 2v2 laning. He's definitely more of a team fight 5v5 type of player. He wants to play games a little bit slower. It's why he's always been more successful on these champions that can kind of counterbalance a lot of his strengths and weaknesses. When I think of Masu, I think of things like Senna that he's really successful on. Obviously, he can play things like Kai'Sa at a really high level. In that same vein, you know, Lucian has been able to equalize and neutralize some of his mid-game woes, but generally speaking, this is a guy who you want to get on something that can dominate in the late game with his phenomenal spacing, his great positioning, and his really good instinct for team fights, and you just kind of need to get him there. Do I think he's built to be the best player on a team that wins the league? I hope so. I think mechanically speaking, there is no question that he can be that kind of guy. It is very clear when you watch him in team fights that, you know, just from a pure hands perspective, he's just as good as anybody else in the entire league. It's just that well-roundedness. Can you actively play through Masu in important games where you get him gigantic leads and he takes over and carries? Like, that is a question that he's never really had to answer at a high-end level, because he's only really played with fantastic players over the course of his career. So I like Masu. This is going to be a big year for him because I think if he can step up and be like an MVP caliber player, which I think is certainly a possible outcome for him, FlyQuest is going to be a lot better than maybe I'm expecting them to be. If he is just like the third best AD carry in the league, the second or third best AD carry in the league, which is kind of what he's been over the past couple of years, then I think this team might be in a little bit of trouble. Quad in the mid lane, it's so weird to talk about Quad because he's one of the players I'm higher on now for this FlyQuest team, but anybody who has followed this channel knows that I've really just not been a Quad believer for a long time. I think he was really good at the end of last year, and it felt like a lot of the woes that he had mentally at international tournaments kind of got a little bit better. That being said, Worlds was a disaster in general for this FlyQuest team, and Quad is just not really a big game performer. I think that's something we've seen pretty regularly from him, not only here in North America, but that's something I definitely remember from him back in the LCK, back when he was on DRX and Nongshim and all those other teams. I'm hopeful that he's going to be a leader and somebody who can generate a ton of resources here. I still think he's one of the more mechanically talented mid laners in the region. He probably comes in as like my number 2 or number 3 mid laner, just kind of depending on where you want to put a couple of players. But is that enough? Like, can he be the number 1 guy? That also concerns me. I think you took a lot of the players that I felt the most comfortable about being your number 1, about being your big resource generators, obviously Inspired in the jungle, but even Bwipo on the top side, Busio being an MVP caliber player in the support position, and you just kind of got left with the 2 players that I had the most question marks on in terms of playstyle from last year. Hopefully they're going to be able to stabilize this team, but there's so much responsibility on their shoulders now, and it really is a question on whether or not they can handle that. And then for Gakkos, on the top side, he's kind of the other retention, if you will. He played, a good amount for FlyQuest over the course of last year. They got him in on a couple of games every once in a while. Bwipo got suspended for the LCS Championship or the LTA Championship, and Gakkos had to play a series there. But this is really going to be kind of his rookie year in terms of a tier 1 level. I like his form, and this is where it gets a little bit weird. Like, these players who haven't necessarily played a ton at a tier 1 level, like, how do I grade them? Generally speaking, B is going to be just about as high as I can go for a player that has never played in tier 1. B- is going to be, I think you're a good prospect, and I generally feel comfortable about you starting. C+ is going to be, I'm okay with the pickup. I think that there is a lot of reason to like this, but maybe there were other options. And C is like, I'm not confused or concerned because Cryogen's the only C. I'm going to spoil that right now, at least for our rookie players, but it's certainly a shock to see Cryogen in the LCS, which I will talk about. But Gakkos, as we're getting to this, he's just an interesting player. He doesn't really seem to have like a defined skill set. He's kind of a jack of all trades, master of none right now. That's kind of what we were talking about when FlyQuest originally picked him up, and he never really did anything to completely dissuade that. His laning needs work. He needs to be able to get a little bit more comfortable generating resources on his own without a ton of team intervention. He wasn't really all that great in the 1v1, even against some weaker top laners in the LCS when we saw that, and he really wasn't all that great at that particular part in the TCL or the LFL2 either. So there are just a lot of growing pains for a player like this. I expect him to struggle a little bit at the start, but hopefully he can get his feet under him. I don't necessarily see a ridiculous mechanical upside for him, but you never really know with players that have so little tier 2 experience like he does. Then there's Griffin coming over. He's probably the 3rd best player on this team, which I think is a good thing and a bad thing for them. Obviously, you would love for Griffin to be coming into an environment where he can kind of have his struggles because of just how talented he is, so that he can learn and grow from those, not be worried about making, bad decisions and losing his team games or anything like that. But he is going to have quite a lot of responsibility. Day number 1, basically, on FlyQuest, he's coming in for Inspired. These are both downgrades, in my opinion, not because I think Griffin is a bad prospect to pick up. In fact, I think he's likely one of their better options that they could have gotten. It's just, you're losing Inspired. You're losing the only A+ in this video, and that's a problem, right? Like, Inspired not being an import, being the best player in the league and being somebody who is clearly able to compete at an international level, like, you're just not going to be able to replace that year 1. And that's kind of where the downgrade tag comes in. Instead of this being considered a change, it would be a 99th percentile outcome for Griffin to be what Inspired was this year, right? Like, it's not going to happen. He's going to, at the very least, be a little bit worse, basically, no matter what ends up happening. But it's just about, can he step up year 1 and actually be relevant? I think he looked really good in the LTA South. I think that his aggressive tendencies sometimes got him into trouble, but that was an environment where I think he really got to thrive because he did get to kind of make some mistakes and learn and grow from them over the course of the year. I really liked the tape I saw. I really do think Griffin's going to be a good player at this level, and I wouldn't be surprised if he comes in and, really is like successful. Year number 1 is a top 3 to 4-ish jungler in the league. That wouldn't really be all that surprising to me. It's just kind of gigantic shoes to fill, right? Like being Inspired is just likely not going to happen. Being what Inspired was in 2025 is likely not going to happen, and therefore the team does feel a little bit worse off because of it. And then there's Cryogen in the support position. I want to make it clear, I really like Cryogen as a prospect. I think the tier 3 stuff that we've seen from him is really solid. It's just so hard for me to project this player to tier 1 right now. Like, the floor on Cryogen is so low in terms of what you can expect. And the problem is you're going from the best support in the West in Busio, the player that I think basically every single team that had any money was trying to get. He was my choice for MVP last year, even over Inspired. I really think he was that good for FlyQuest. You're going from that to a player who's played, I think you can count on one hand the amount of games he's played in tier 2. Like, it's just a tough sell, right? He was a substitute for FlyQuest challengers under Chime, which was something that got me really excited because I think Chime was a phenomenal player and a very smart player. I think Cryogen getting to learn from him and getting to be in the FlyQuest system for a year was great. And then last year, obviously the Polestar stuff happens and he goes to Maryville and, you know, plays a little bit there, but really doesn't have a ton of tier 2 action, is a substitute again last year. And now he's getting a tier 1 spot. There's a world where he's really good. Again, even in the games we've seen him, it's been some up and down play. If you can get a lot of the good plays that we've seen out of Cryogen as a playmaker, like he could be a top half support year 1, and that would be a phenomenal outcome. But if we're ranking these players at their floor, there's not a single player in the league with a lower floor than Cryogen, because I just have no clue what he is going to be. He's not going to be Busio year 1. Again, like that's just one of the takeaways here is like, as much as I wish that, you know, Cryogen and Griffin are going to be able to come in and dominate the league immediately, I think it would just be astounding if that does end up being the case. The question is, can he come in and be like a B caliber player? Can he be Ayla? Can he be, you know, Huhi? Can he be that level of support, right, where he can come in and really stabilize and allow players like Masu and Quad to be able to take over? There are so many question marks on FlyQuest. I like the decision where it's like, okay, well, we don't have the resources to actually go out and compete, so we want to get talent that we can build around and that we can start our rebuild with, because I do think Griffin and Cryogen and, you know, maybe Gatgos, like they can turn into players that you can build an LCS winning championship team around. But can they do that year 1? I just would be really surprised. FlyQuest is likely going to be a team that's a little bit closer to the middle of the pack this year, and I think that's going to be a little bit frustrating, I think, for maybe some FlyQuest fans. But then moving on to our second place team from last year, and unfortunately, our second place team in 100 Thieves is no longer in the league, but we can talk about the team that came in and bought their spot. It's the newly integrated to the LCS Sentinels as the second team that we are going to talk about here. I do have 100 Thieves' roster from last year listed on the top of, you know, everything here. It just kind of felt fair. I get that they didn't really inherit the roster, but this spot was these players, and now it is these players. It does kind of feel fair to grade them on what 100 Thieves was, even if, again, they're not like just a copy and paste replacement. I'm not trying to, you know, imply that they had the chance to keep all these players and didn't. I'm just kind of showcasing where they're at in comparison to the team that had their spot last year. This is how I've always done it. Just kind of feels fair when a new team comes into the league. But I'm super excited for Sentinels. This is obviously an organization that has been in League of Legends before under a different banner back when they were Phoenix 1, and they were a really fun team back in the day. Obviously, the bad years kind of get overlooked because the good half a year essentially that they had with Arrow and with Mike Young was just so fun to watch. I think Ryu was on that team as well. Some crazy stuff, but Sentinels is now making their re-debut here in the LCS, and I, for one, am really excited to see what this team looks like, because I think they've actually built a roster that is intriguing on paper, if not a little bit surprising in terms of the way things broke down. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup for 2026 is looking like Impact in the top lane, Hambach in the jungle, Darkwings in the mid lane, Rahel at AD carry, and Huhi at support. I think it's fair to keep the DSG boys kind of slotted together here as we start things off. 3 players coming over from last year's Disguise team, Darkwings, Rahel, and Huhi. The bot lane coming over, to me, if they were available, I think that is a no-brainer. It's a phenomenal pickup. Rahel is a ridiculously good player. He not only single-handedly saved DSG's season, shout out Darkwings. We'll talk about him. I'm still excited for Darkwings, but Rahel was incredible for that team. And, you know, in a league where I think AD carry is so good at the top end level, I think to compete, you need an AD carry that you feel comfortable can be like near the top of the league. I don't think you can pretend to be like a top 1 or a top 2 team at any point if your AD carry is not like really good. And I think Rahel is really good. I think he's better than FBI. I have this listed as an upgrade here down on the bot side. I would much rather have Rahel even with the import status. I think, again, mechanically speaking, this guy's got an argument for being basically just behind LYON and Berserker in terms of like true mechanics at the AD carry position, and he knows what to do with it. He's a very well-rounded player who just kind of is good at the game. I know he kind of gets, I guess, overlooked by a lot of analysts because he's never been on good teams. You know, the DK Challengers team was great, but he goes over to SK Gaming and that whole situation is a disaster. And obviously he comes in and has to save Disguise Season, but he does so really successfully. Like, he's never been on a team that actually has been able to compete near the top of the standings, but I really think talent-wise, it is very clear that this guy deserves to be on a top-tier team, and I hope that this can be that roster because I think there's some interesting pieces around him. Huhi in the support position is obviously a good bring. Him and Rahel seem to have good chemistry at the end of the year. Huhi was really unfortunately blamed, I think, for a lot of the problems with Disguised. He looked a lot worse than I think he is individually as a player because he had so much responsibility on that DSG team. He was the primary shot caller, and he kind of needed to be the one that was orchestrating the entire early game for that team because of the way things were set up with their roster. Having Abadaga in the mid lane was just not good for a majority of the year. The moment that they swapped things around, Darkwings is a much better laner. Rahel comes in and is a much better laner. Huhi has much more freedom to actually be able to play the mid game in the way that supports are supposed to, and he looks a lot better because of that. Do I think he's better than Ayla? I don't think Huhi in 2025 was better than Ayla, but the reason I'm listing this as a change instead of as a downgrade is because if Huhi was just as good as Ayla was last year, that would not be a surprise at all to me. That would be a pretty normal outcome, I think, for a player of his caliber, and I think it's pretty easy to expect that. So for now, he comes in as a B-, but if he performed a lot closer to a B, you know, there were times where I was calling him an A-, B+ caliber support when he was on Golden Guardians and 100 Thieves back in the day. So certainly can see an outcome where he just kind of is on a better team now, has more talent around him, and can kind of, you know, stabilize and set himself up. And then there's Darkwings. I'm really glad he's getting another shot at the tier 1 level. We've seen so many players ping pong back from, you know, tier 2 to tier 1 to tier 2, right? And I'm so glad that Darkwings coming in and performing, you know, pretty solid for DSG gets him another job here, even if it isn't on Disguised. He's definitely a player that I think has, I don't want to say limited upside in terms of like a playstyle potential, but he doesn't really have that like killer instinct. He's just really stable, and I think that that's really valuable. Can this guy be the 4th or 5th best mid laner consistently in the LCS? Yeah, like that's absolutely the kind of upside that you can get with Darkwings. Do I ever think he's gonna kind of break out and be that #1 mid laner like I think some other, you know, young prospects right now can? I'm not sure. I just don't know if he has the mechanical upside, but he's a good laner and he's a really good team fighter. Very stable, especially on control mages. He fits this team well. Him and Rahel, I think both ended up playing off of each other well as a carry duo because Rahel is much more, you know, hyper carry minded. He wants to play things like Jinx, and Darkwings can, you know, function really well as that secondary or even tertiary carry throughout a majority of the game without a ton of resources, where he can just kind of play 1v1 and be really stable. He is a starting caliber player, maybe not a superstar, but a good player to bring over for Sentinels. And then we get to the bigger discussions. We'll start with Hambach in the jungle. Hambach is a really interesting case here because I just spent the last year kind of ragging on him over in the LCK when I talked about him basically every week. He was the worst player in the entire league for me last year, was not really all that competent as a jungler, actively made Bro worse. The moment that he got swapped out for Krako midway through the year, Bro got significantly more competitive, but Hambach was the guy coming off of his 2024 season where he completed the Golden Road on KT Rolster's Challengers team in tier 2, where he was just dominant across every single tournament and, you know, split that they could possibly play. He was the guy coming out of that team where it was like, oh, he has MVP potential in the LCK, and obviously things don't work out, but a lot of things don't work out on Bro for many different players. I think Hambach still comes in basically as a prospect. I'm kind of writing off a lot of 2025 in that I think the situation was bad, and I think the jump from the LCK Challengers League to the LCK is the largest tier 2 to tier 1 jump in the entire world. Hambach coming over to North America, do I think he could be like a real difference-making type of jungler? Yes. I know people are frustrated with the import situation. I'll talk about that a bit more when we get to some of the other teams that have more egregious imports, but for me, it's always been a conversation of your job as a GM is to build the most valuable team that you can, whether that's through prospects or whether that's through actively winning now, right? I think, you know, obviously building a team of average players is not particularly good, but Hambach is one of the few players in the LCK sphere, in the Korean sphere, that genuinely has like MVP potential. I think he has the same kind of upside that someone like Thanatos did when he came over from the Challengers League, that someone like Saint did when he came over from the Challengers League. I think he should be considered in that vein of prospects, just with a little bit higher risk, right? I think that there is a chance that he ends up, kind of flaming out a little bit more than maybe you see from those other players. But I like this addition, and hopefully he can, kind of put everything together, because that 2024 tape that we saw from him was just astounding. And if he can get that back, he is going to be a monster at this level. And then Impact in the top lane. This is an interesting one. I'm excited for them because I think he's going to be better than he was last year, but I do have to talk about last year, right? I think you can make a strong argument that he was the worst top laner in the LCS last year in terms of just raw production. He was constantly losing. His laning stats were abysmal, and the eye test was even worse. So it just kind of came down to, okay, do we just have to hope and pray that Impact just, I talk about it all the time, but year one on a new team for Impact is always so good, and then year two is always so bad when he changes teams. This is year one on a new roster on a Sentinels team where he's kind of being brought in as the, in-game leader, as the emotional veteran for them, for players like Hambach and Rahel that have all this upside in the world, but don't necessarily have, like, the highest floor, if you will. Impact is supposed to be the stabilizer. If he's continuing to get absolutely dominated in lane, I don't think it's going to matter. I think he's going to continue to be, a low tier, low value player at the LCS level. But if he can come in and stabilize in lane and be a good team fighter like he was, throughout most of his career, if he can be what he was for TL in 2024, that was an MVP caliber player. So depending on which version of Impact you're getting, this can kind of change a little bit, but I'm considering this a change from Dokla, even if Dokla was definitely better than Impact last year. So what's the overall consensus for this team? Well, I like the upside here. I think that there is a world where this team competes to be top 2 or top 3. I don't think the LCS is, I don't think the upper tier, I should say, in the LCS is impenetrable. I absolutely think that some of those spots are going to be up for grabs, and I think this team has the upside to potentially get there if both Hambach and Rahel are like superstar caliber players, which I think is totally possible. If both of them perform like, B plus A minus caliber players, this team is going to be competing near the top of the standings because Darkwings is so stable, who he is a very good player, and Impact is likely going to be strong in that case, or at the very least not a big enough negative to completely derail the game. But I could also see a world where Hambach is much more like he was in the LCK, where he's not very good, where Rahel has to do so much of the work because you don't really have a secondary carry, and where Impact is getting dominated in lane. You don't really have a superstar mid laner here, and they end up just kind of flaming out into a 6th. I think both of those outcomes are pretty reasonable. This team is pretty volatile, but they are pretty fun. I quite like this offseason, if I'm being honest. Then moving on to our third team of the video, and it's an unlikely third team, but they were so close to being able to make Worlds, they just couldn't quite make it work. It was Shopify Rebellion, who came in third in the LTA North last year, and they only make one change, but boy, is it a big, big change for this team, for their playstyle, for their expectations moving forward, because I think they just went from a team that overperformed a lot in 2025, really kind of took the talent level that they had and got the most out of it, especially at the end of the year, and they basically just turned into a team that I think can very reasonably expect to compete to go to Worlds again in 2026, which is just a really exciting thing to say for this org. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Fudge in the top lane, Contracts in the jungle, Zinni now in the mid lane, B-Void, AD carry, and Seos at support. We'll get to Zinni last because I'm really excited to talk about him, but let's go over the Shopify Rebellion members first. It's Bs across the board for Shopify, at the very least of the players that are returning here. We'll start with Fudge on the top side. What a funny year for Fudge, all things considered. He was pretty terrible at the start of the year. We had a lot of people in my comment section that were constantly dogging on him and kind of saying that he was washed, that he was cooked, and it really felt like every single week I had to come on and be like, guys, please just give him a little bit more time. Like, the underlying things are really good here. You go and watch him play top lane, and he passes the eye test. A lot of the things he's doing are really positive. He's going neutral in a lot of laning phases, and then it's just like 1 or 2 lapses in judgment that really end up throwing his game off. If he can start cleaning those up like he did on Cloud9, he's going to be a really valuable player. Lo and behold, that's exactly what happens at the end of the year. He ends up cleaning up a lot of those mistakes, and he's really valuable in this team's playoff run. I'm not going to sit here and try and pretend like Fudge is a top 1 or top 2 top laner in the LCS, because I think that role, it's just so volatile, and he's going to have matchups that he just inherently loses, but top lane is not a strong role right now in the West. If Fudge was somebody that could compete near the top of the LCS, no one is really going to be all that surprised. This is a guy who has been an MVP candidate before for Cloud9, and I think while he's not in his prime, prime right now. This is not like the peak version of Fudge. The inconsistency is still there. That's why he's a B and not a B+. He's a good player, and he's somebody that you're happy to have as a starter, especially in a league that doesn't have a ton of really stable top laners. And then you have someone like Contracts in the jungle that I think really elevates this team. He was unquestionably the best player on Shopify Rebellion last year, and it's just really cool to see Contracts still playing at such a high level in 2025. Like, you know, I don't want to like nerd out, but it's just, this was the kid that came in as like the next up and coming young jungle prospect for Cloud9 back in like 2017, like that era of the team, and it just never really felt like it landed. He had to go back to tier 2 multiple times, but he's really established himself as one of the more consistent junglers in the league, and somebody that you really can rely on if you want to try and get to Worlds. Like, that's the kind of playstyle that he has. Is he volatile? Yes, he's led the league in deaths almost every single split he's ever played in tier 1, but he does so because he's constantly looking for engage angles and because he's a really great setup player for the rest of his team. When I think of what Contracts does at a really high level, I think of him playing tanks. Like you don't typically think of somebody who is so greedy and aggressive like him as somebody who goes out there and wants to play like Maokai or Sejuani or whatever, but that's always been the stuff that I think he's always excelled on because his engage angles, his ability to team fight 5v5, it's really, really great. And if he were a little bit more consistent at being able to play the early game, then I think he would be a B+, you know, maybe an A-, not really. He's a little bit a ways off, I would say, from an A-, but a B+ caliber player. I think that that's totally fair to say. And if you think he's going to perform like a B+ caliber player, be my guest. Give him that ranking. He's just not been particularly consistent over the course of his entire career, so it's hard for me to buy in that he's definitely going to be a B+ going into next year. That's, again, the inconsistency. It's why he gets the B, but this guy is like the star of the team. He is definitely the leader right now, and he's going to be the one that I think has the most on his shoulders this year, getting Zinni acclimated to the LCS and, you know, getting this team rolling in the right direction. And then you've got the bot lane, Bvoy and Seos. Not really a lot to talk about here. Bvoy gets hyped up a little bit more than maybe I think he should when you go and watch the tape. And, you know, people aren't going to like when I say this, but boy, is he similar to Hans Sama in a lot of very, very distinct ways, where he is a good laner, but only really if he gets a lot of resources in the early game. If he's left on his own to you know, to kind of just 2v2. He's more of an average player. You're definitely going to find a lot of situations where he's just not quite as consistent. As a team fighter, he can have big pop-off moments, but he doesn't always have that consistency that you're looking for. His positioning in some fights can be absolutely horrendous when you go and watch, like, especially some of their losses in the playoffs. When you go back to the LTA championships. I once again called it LCS. I keep having to cut because I'm calling it the LCS championships. I'm not going to cut anymore. If I call it the LCS, I'm so sorry, instead of the LTA. I know that I'm still talking about 2025, but some of the positioning mistakes he made during that tournament were just disgustingly bad. But when it works, when he looks good, it looks really, really good. And it's just that, again, that inconsistency that does knock him down a bit. Seos is an interesting player. He's kind of the opposite of everybody else on this team, where Fudge, Contracts, Bvoy, these are all players with very high highs, but, you know, decently low lows. You just don't necessarily know if they're going to crash out on any given game. Seos doesn't really have bad games. Like, he's not really that kind of player. He's much more stable than everybody else on the team, but I also think his highs are much less high than the other three, at least in terms of how he's performed in the LCS in North America. You know, when you go back to his time in Brazil, I was pounding the table for this guy over and over again to get signed by a major region, whether it be the LCS or the LEC, because it really felt like every single year when I watched the CB LOL, this guy was popping off and playing like the best player in the entire league. You know, obviously he got his chance here, and I think he made the most of it. He almost made Worlds with this team, but, you know, I don't think he's a superstar. I think he reminds me a lot of Ayla as a player in terms of how he ends up playing, where he's not necessarily going to be the biggest playmaker. He's not going to be the one that's kind of pushing your team forward, but he's very stable, not really going to make a lot of mistakes, and I think he's good for this team in terms of the I guess, overall play style that he ends up bringing. Much more engage focused in terms of how he likes to play tank engage, especially, but can kind of branch out a little bit from that. And then the big new addition, you've got Zinni coming into the mid lane, and this guy's never played a tier 1 game, but I feel confident saying that this is an upgrade over Palafox. I'm going to be honest, this guy might win MVP very soon. Like, I really think that highly of Zinni. Anybody who follows the channel knows that I do not give out B grades to players who have never played in tier 1. Like, it's certainly not something I do, especially not to imports, right? Because first off, you just don't know how people are going to adapt to moving across the entire world and an entirely new culture, and just like life in general in America can be very different than life in Korea, and getting used to that while also playing your best on the Rift is just hard. Like, it's not an easy thing to get done, but also you just never really know how someone is going to translate their game from something like the Challengers League to the LCS. But Zinni just you have to hope that he is everything he's supposed to be. I think he was the prize of the offseason for basically everybody in both North America and Europe and in China. Like, whatever teams were looking at Zinni, whoever got him was going to be winners of the offseason just by proxy of getting him. And for it to be Shopify Rebellion, I just think is kind of insane. And I'm really excited to see if he can come in and be this team's kind of new, like, superstar. I think it's really possible that you have a team full of B caliber players that are really, inconsistent but very high highs, and now you're bringing in a superstar mid laner, and now all of a sudden you can open things up. I think it's really possible for Shopify to be an LCS winning team this year if Zinni is as good as I think he is. To put it into perspective on how I view him as a prospect, we talked about some guys earlier. I'm not going to bring up Hambach, his former teammate, because he had a weird year in the LCK, but we talked about Thanatos and we talked about Saint. We can even bring Loki into that discussion, even someone like Quid we can bring into that discussion from a couple of years ago as prospects that came from the LCK Challengers League. Zinni is a better prospect from a Challengers League perspective than any of them were. I feel very confident in saying that. People won't agree with that. I think that's more of my take when I watch the Challengers League as somebody who's like really invested in that league. I think Zinni was much better than Saint was on DK Challengers. I think Zinni was better than Thanatos was on DK Challengers. Like, I really do see this guy as having basically unlimited upside at this level. He could be the best player in the entire league from a mechanics perspective, and I really wouldn't be all that surprised. But again, the floor is there. I'm talking about him like he's an A+ caliber player. He's just not. He's never played a game at the tier 1 level. He's just a stud prospect. He is somebody that doesn't just walk in the door every once in a while. Like, he is truly one of those like one-of-one type of potential players, and I just hope that this is the organization and this is the team that can get the most out of him, because he really should be the kind of player that can compete not only to go to Worlds, but like to be an MVP here in the LCS. Obviously, he is an upgrade over Palafox. Palafox was the weak link of this team last year. They knew they needed to move in a different direction, and Zinni is just about as good as you can do from a potential perspective. There is a world where this is the best team in the LCS. I don't think that's a likely outcome. I think that a lot would have to go right for that to be the case, but if Zinni is like a superstar, they're probably going to be pretty close to being the best team in the LCS. I think more likely they're going to be a borderline top 3 team, a team that's constantly fighting it out throughout most of the year, kind of like they were last year, except with significantly more mechanical upside because of what Zinni can offer in the mid lane. I'm really excited to see what ends up happening here. The contract Zinni mid-jungle duo is probably the funniest on paper in the entire world, so I'm really just excited to see how that ends up breaking down. And again, if everything hits for this team, watch out. They could genuinely be real threats this year. But then moving on to our 4th team of the video, and a team that I think everybody expected to be top 2, and they just never really were able to figure it out. Very limited changes, one of the few teams really running a lot of their roster back from last year. It's Cloud9 coming in, only making one change to the mid lane here, and it was not a forced one. This team was very prepared and very ready to run back all 5 members of their starting lineup from 2025, but Loki wants to go back to Korea. He misses his family. That's what I talk about. Sometimes it's tough moving across the entire world and just being expected to be at your absolute best mental and physical performance for these games when you're not really acclimating to life in America. Loki was obviously somebody who I think had potential to be a really highly rated player here in North America, but just couldn't really find it in him to, keep playing in North America, and I think that that's totally fine. I think Cloud9 adapted and moved on pretty well here. I'm going to talk about why I really like their addition here and why I think that this team should be one of the better teams in the entire league, so long as they can recover from some of their biggest mistakes from last year. But let's go ahead and talk about them. Their lineup is looking like Thanatos in the top lane, Blabber in the jungle, APA in the mid lane, Sven at AD carry, and Vulcan at support. Of course, this is a team that, 4 of the 5 members are coming back and they underperformed last year, and so there's this natural expectation that perhaps, I guess, like, the overall hype for them should be a bit diminished going into 2026 compared to the actual talent level on the team. But boy, is there still a lot of talent on Cloud9. We can talk about the A- players first, Thanatos and Vulcan. These are the players that I feel very comfortable are just some of the best players in the league. Thanatos was pretty unquestionably the best top laner in North America last year. I think Bwipo had a good argument to at least be in the conversation, but I think most people would have taken Thanatos' side in that argument. I certainly would have, and he comes in as my #1 top laner heading into 2026 as well. he's basically become everything that people wanted him to become. He was an interesting prospect coming out of the Challengers League because I was a bit lower on him, I think, than other people were, mostly because I think he had a pretty one-dimensional game in the Challengers League. He was a phenomenal laner, and he just had no clue what he was supposed to be doing in team fights. And you know what? That's exactly what he was when he first debuted for Cloud9. It took him a bit of time to get comfortable and to really start to evolve his game, but we saw towards the end of last year that a lot of those late game struggles at staying relevant in a game where things are kind of moving away from you, they evaporated. Like, he just was really valuable throughout basically every single game that he played. He clearly received a lot of really great coaching on exactly how and when to make a lot of his rotations and how to affect the map a little bit more as a top laner, because he was a much bigger impact towards the end of last year than he was when he first got imported for Cloud9. And if that development is real, if he's going to be able to maintain that now that Reaper is gone, then, you know, I'm sure that he's going to continue to be one of the best players in the league. A- might even be a little bit too low in terms of the actual talent level for him, but again, he gets knocked a little bit for being an import. He was kind of on the borderline of being an A or an A-. I ended up going with A- because he does take up an import slot in terms of value, but this guy absolutely on any given day can play like an A or an A+. I think best case scenario, he can turn into what Kana has been for K-Corp over in the LEC. We'll skip Blabber for a second. We'll get back to him, but let's talk about the bot lane first, starting with Vulcan in the support position. He's the other player that I just don't think there's any sort of argument for. I think this guy has consistently played well since re-emerging for Cloud9 at the end of 2024. Really summer split 2024, and then all of 2025, he was the second best support in North America, only behind Busio. You know, we'll talk about Core JJ in a second. I think Vulcan has very clearly been better than Core over the past year and a half, but he doesn't necessarily get the same kind of credit that I think someone like Core gets, because I think he does it in a way that goes a bit more under the radar. This guy is constantly impacting games as both an engager and an enchanter. He's pretty open in terms of the way that he wants to play, and Sven is very stuck in his style. He's very much that secondary carry, wants to be more of a weak side ADC, and it kind of forces Vulcan to be a lot more proactive, but he's so good at being able to move around the map and create advantages for his team that it almost doesn't really matter. I think this was an essential retention. Thanatos and Vulcan are very much the core of this team, and I'm glad that they brought both of them back. Then there's Sven. I feel pretty good about Sven coming back here as well. I think he got underrated quite a lot last year in terms of the way he was playing. He's never really been the kind of player that I think you think of like as a resource dominator. Like, he's not somebody who's going to be up 50 CS and absolutely destroying the 2v2 and, you know, going into the late game with 10 kills and being able to hyper carry. It's just not really the style that Sven has, you know, always been all that good at. But last year, he was really winning 2v2s. Now, part of that is Vulcan is just being, Vulcan's really good, right? Like, Vulcan's really good in lane and out of lane. He can generate a lot of advantages for a bot lane basically on his own. But Sven was very much, you know, living up to his end of the deal. He was doing a really good job being that resource getter and really just winning in the 2v2. He's always been very stable in the late game as a bot lane player. I've always compared Sven to like someone like Teddy over in the LCK. In fact, I think they're almost identical players. It's just that, you know, obviously the LCK is tougher to play in. Sven is a very stable player that you can really rely on just being in the right place at the right time. He's never really going to take over the game unless you devise your entire game plan around it. But because he gets to play with such a talented support, he can actually do a really good job of being one of the more consistent and stable bot lanes in the entire league. He was excellent for a majority of last year. Obviously, things didn't work out at the end of the year, but, you know, we'll see if that ends up translating. For most of 2025, this was one of the better bot lanes in the West. And then there's Blabber. Now, Blabber's a more interesting discussion, obviously kind of the face of Cloud9. He is the brand here at this point. He is the multiple-time MVP, the superstar. This is a guy who's received an A+ on these grades before, going back to like 2021, 2022, like during his prime. Blabber just came off the worst year of his entire career, which makes it a bit more difficult to try and evaluate where he's at. I'm not going to sit here and say that last year was entirely Blabber's fault, but I do believe he was the biggest reason why this team missed Worlds. I think if he had played up to his own standard, no question would this have been a top 2 team in North America, but he really was lackluster, especially towards the end of the year. He needs to fix that. Right now, the issue for him is just that he's not particularly consistent at controlling the early game, and that used to be a big advantage of him, or of his game plan, at least in, you know, 2021, 2020, you know, that era where he was winning MVPs. Like, the big advantage that Blabber had as a player was the fact that he was so good at being able to make sure his team was in the right spot. Why he would struggle internationally is because teams could take away a lot of that comfort. But like we saw last year, even on the tanks that he was almost always really stable on, he just has not been all that good at being able to actually generate good lane states and good game states for his team. He needs to be better than what he was last year. If you want to be low on Cloud9 heading into 2026, saying that, oh, this roster ended up basically staying the same, we'll talk about basically the side grade that happened in the mid lane, and you know, Thanatos and Sven and Vulcan are all still here, right? Like, if you want to be pessimistic about what Cloud9 is going to be, it's because of Blabber. It's saying that what Blabber showed last year is kind of just who Blabber is now. He's not going to be a top 2 jungler in the region, and he's going to struggle. I'm somewhere in the middle. I have him ranked as a B+ because I think he's too good to be a B, even if he's a bit more inconsistent. But I think the range of outcomes here is pretty wide. For most of the end of last year, this guy was playing like a B caliber player, which is not really good enough for the aspirations that this team has. If he can even kind of get back to what he was in 2024, where he was just the second best jungler in the league, Inspired was clearly the best, but he was still pretty good and, you know, was maybe a bit underrated in 2024. Like, if he can even just get back to that, like, that's an A-ish caliber player. That kind of performance from Blabber is probably good enough for Cloud9 to win the league. So a lot of this year is going to be up to Blabber in the jungle and whether or not this guy can actually play like we know he can. Hopefully he can. You know, Blabber is one of my favorite players ever. I'm pretty vocal about that. He's always been an absolute treat to watch, and especially, you know, for those dark years in North America, you know, he was the best player in the league for multiple years in a row. It's really, you know, I'm hopeful that Blabber can get that nice bounce back because it wasn't all that good last year. And then the one change this team is making, they're going from Loki in the mid lane to APA. I have this listed as a change. They're both going to be graded as B+ players. I think they're pretty similar in terms of output. You guys know I think there's a pretty big cluster after number 1 in terms of the mid lane rankings in North America, and I think APA and Loki were both a part of that. I think they're decently different players, but the first thing I want to, you know, point out is that Cloud9's really good at this, like this whole reclamation project. Like, they are very, very good at bringing in players that were good on other teams, especially top tier teams, but maybe never necessarily got the same kind of, I guess, resources and support around them that, you know, a lot of other players might get in different situations, bringing them into Cloud9 and making it work. Sven Skaren's a great example. Sven on this team is a great example. I'm not going to list Vulcan because he was basically a rookie when they brought him in, but like, this team is very good at being able to identify players that might not be as valued by the rest of the league as maybe they should be. And I think APA kind of falls into that category quite a bit. This is a very good mid laner. Is he a superstar? Probably not. There have been times where there's been like flashes of him being a really good player, but is this guy like a borderline top 2 or top 3 mid laner in the league? Yes, like absolutely. On any given day, he can be the second best mid laner in North America. That's the kind of open debate that I think you have for that number 2 spot, and he is good enough to fill that void, and I think he's a good playstyle fit on this team. Obviously, he likes to play for late game, he likes to scale, and I think that this team generally has a really good mid game, and so it's going to be a little bit easier for them to transition a lot of that into where he, you know, kind of thrives as a player. Those, you know, Smolder, Aurelion Sol type of picks that he wants to play in team fights. He's gotten a lot better at being able to play the mid game out as well. His laning really isn't all that bad. There have been multiple games that he's just been able to win on his own. I don't think he got nearly enough credit for how he played at the beginning of last year when Team Liquid was the best team in North America in winter. If him and Blabber have good chemistry together to be able to play out the early game, get through the mid game, and get to a team fight stage where you're kind of relying on APA and Sven and Thanatos, like, that's a scary team. That is a very difficult team to try and face. I think the talent level on this team is maybe the highest across the board in the entire league. I'm not guaranteeing that this is going to be a team that wins a championship or anything like that, but a lot of people are talking about some other rosters here as potential favorites to win the LCS. I think Cloud9 has just as good of an argument as anyone if they can just rebound over some of the mental mistakes that they were making at the end of last year. Talent-wise, they absolutely should be right there. It's really about whether or not they can put it together. Then moving on to our 5th team of the video, and it's back-to-back teams that I think had bigger expectations for last year than maybe what they ended with, but at least this team got a trophy out of it. It was Team Liquid, who of course won the winter split, went to first stand, was the first team eliminated, and then proceeded to not make a single other international tournament throughout the rest of the entire year. Not really the best look for TL, and they kind of knew that, and so they made some roster changes midway through last year, where gets replaced by Yuji, and then even more going into 2026, where their entire top side is completely overhauled. At the beginning of this offseason, I was ready to say that Team Liquid was back, that like 2018 Team Liquid, you know, bringing in Double Lift and bringing in, you know, Pobelter and then Jensen, Core JJ coming over, like Impact coming in, like, you know, that era where it's like, oh, Team Liquid spending the most amount of money so that they can just win the LCS. I was like, oh, we're back to that, where Liquid just goes and, you know, gets this fantastic roster. They bring Quid in the mid lane. It feels like Inspired is kind of destined to be here, but Inspired chooses LYON instead, which we will talk about later, and Team Liquid has to pivot into a roster that now I really don't know how to feel, right? Like, I think the good parts of this team are the best in the entire league, and I think that the top side is weak, and I'm going to be quite frank about that. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Morgan in the top lane, Jose Deodo in the jungle, Quid in the mid lane, Yon at AD carry, and Core JJ at support. You are retaining your bot lane. That is the only part that's coming back. This is the core, pun entirely intended, of this team, of Team Liquid in terms of, you know, how they are put together. Yon is, in my opinion, still the best AD carry in North America. I know that there is some dissension, some conversation about that right now, but from a mechanical perspective, to me, it's just not even all that close. This guy can do things that just basically and no other AD carry in the league can do. Maybe with Berserker coming back, he's going to have a little bit more competition here, but he's still going to be an A- grade despite the fact that this team was not able to accomplish their goals. Even when this team is getting absolutely rolled at the end of the year, when they just were not all that competitive, Yon was still the one player that was actually playing like he deserved to be there. Like, he was, you know, actually performing well, I would say, for basically all of the year. This guy just, it's hard to win as an AD carry when you are the only player that is living up to your own promise. And even the bot lane, we'll talk about Core JJ. I think Core was better last year than he was in 2024, which I don't think is necessarily a popular opinion, but Yon and Core, more than happy about. I still think you can make the argument that this is the best bot lane in the league, and, you know, I think I probably will be making that argument. It's either them or Cloud9, in my opinion, that deserves to have that title, at least as a full bot lane. And I think Yon likely has the lead, like I said, for the best AD carry in the league. So I feel really good about Yon coming back here. He is the core of this team. If you don't know his playstyle, he's basically the anti-Masu. Like, him, it's funny, him and Masu are kind of the two big, you know, endemic young North American AD carries. And Yon is super lane dominant. You can basically give him anything, and he's going to generate a gigantic gold lead in the 2v2. Not always the most consistent in team fights down the stretch of the game. He can, you know, sometimes miss position, be a little bit too aggressive, especially when, you know, a lot of gold is on his shoulders and when he kind of has to carry, whereas Masu's definitely much less lane dominant, but much more consistent in team fights. I just think it's more valuable to be lane dominant than it is to be killer in team fights in the current game, where I think you can affect the game a lot more if you are better at generating resources than if you have to hope and pray that resources come to you. Obviously, not trying to talk down on Masu. He's much better than just some passenger on his teams, but Yon is kind of a different breed of player. I think his playstyle is perfect for the modern game, and I think his mechanics are better, which is why he ends up getting the nod for me as the A-. And then there's Core JJ. He's kind of been that stable B+ for quite a while now. I think that there were some times where he was a little bit worse than maybe people want to admit, because he's Core JJ and because everybody loves him. He's not always the most consistent player in the world, but for the most part, I would say 90% of the time, this guy is your very stable, very consistent support. It's not the best meta for him as a player. He really became like one of the greatest supports of all time during the meta where you could roam at level 3 and just kind of do whatever you wanted for a majority of the game. Level 6 is too relevant right now for supports. Same thing for Redemption. It's just too relevant to be able to pick up those core item components. He's still very good at being able to fight over things like grubs, but because Yon is such a lane dominant player, Core has had to transition his gameplay a little bit more into being 2v2 focused, and I think he's just not quite as dominant in the 2v2 as he is when he just kind of gets to be the second jungler moving around the map, but he's still very good, and in fact, I think he was better at it last year than he was in 2024 in terms of being able to just kind of stabilize the 2v2 and really push Yon's advantage forward. He's awesome. You know, there's not really much to say. The vocal leader component, like, that he brings to Team Liquid, like just the veteran leadership, like that brings him probably to like an A or an A-, but because I can't really quantify that in terms of being able to analyze it, he just kind of stays at a B+ because that's where I think his gameplay is at. Again, I think the overall impact that he has on this team is a little bit more than a B- or a B+ grade would indicate, but certainly something to note there. And then the first big signing of the offseason, and to me the biggest signing of the offseason, Quid, going over to Team Liquid. This is an upgrade in the mid lane. He is the best mid laner in North America. I don't think there's any conversation surrounding that at this point. There is no more, you know, oh, can Quid do it on the biggest stage? I really defended Quid a lot after he performed, you know, we'll just say not so great at the 2024 World Championships. I kind of came into 2025 saying he's by far the best mid laner in North America, and I'm not worried about the world's performance, and people were really pushing back on me for that, but I'm glad to see that he kind of silenced a lot of the haters in 2025, and to me, he's an A-graded player. Like, he's only behind Inspired in terms of value. He would be right on par with what Busio is. I think he could even be considered an A+. Again, he's an import, and he takes up an import slot, so that there is a little bit of, you know, value that's kind of lost in that, but Quid is so far and away the best mid laner in NA in terms of mechanics, in terms of early game, in terms of mid game, in terms of late game. Like, he's just the best at every phase of the game. That, to me, that's deserving of an A ranking, and he is an upgrade over APA. Like, don't get it wrong. I like APA. I think he's a solid player, a little bit one-dimensional. He's grown a lot in terms of being able to play the early game, but there's no mid laner in the region that would not be, that would be better than Quid. Like, you would take Quid over basically anybody else in North America. So Team Liquid, with that side of the map, like Quid, LYON, Core, JJ, like that is a trio of players that absolutely should be winning the LCS every single split. Like, that is a trio that's just as good, if not better, than like the trio that you had on FlyQuest last year that was able to dominate North America. Now, the problem for me, for Team Liquid, comes in how they rounded out this roster, which is the top side. I'm going to start with Morgan here. You guys know my thoughts on Morgan if you watch my LCK coverage. I think he's been good for a little while, like on Bro. I think he's been pretty stable, a mediocre LCK top laner, somebody who falls in like the 5 to 7 range in terms of LCK top laners, which is not bad. Like, again, there are a lot of players that, would fall low. Like someone like Henna last year came over and was like an average 80 carry at this level for LYON. He was a little bit lower on the totem pole than someone like Morgan was. Morgan's had good splits before. He's been somebody who's been in consideration for all pro votes for me, for top 3 teams before, like 3rd team all pro votes. Like, he's somebody who has had success. I'm just worried because he's coming off the worst split that he's had since he broke out, like since he went over to Bro. Like, obviously he was probably worse on Hanwha Life, but he was also asked to do a lot more on Hanwha Life, and it really kind of felt like the wheels fell off in the summer split for Morgan when he started getting destroyed in lane. It felt like his concentration was lapsed a lot, and also I just don't think Morgan has like the highest ceiling in the world for a player. I think mechanically speaking, he's very limited. I think he ends up winning a lot because he's very solid in matchups, and he doesn't necessarily have this like game-breaking type of upside. This reminds me a ton of when this team imported from Bro as well, and they were just kind of hoping that he was going to be a big game changer for them, and he never really was. Like, he was always just an average to slightly below average jungler at this level. I think Morgan is going to fill a very similar role. He's the of top lane, and I'm not excited about that, right? Like, I think that there are multiple top laners in North America that are better than Morgan, and I think him coming in, it's not exciting to me. Like, I wish this was a young player. I think if this were a young player, I would feel a lot better, especially because you got rid of Yuji, and we'll talk about that in a second. But like, if this were, Surdy or someone like that, then I think things feel a lot more interesting for a team like Team Liquid, a player that actually genuinely has upside. I just don't think Morgan is ever going to be better than, like, at best, like the 3rd or 4th best top laner in the league. He's like a low ceiling player, and I think that just frustrates me. He's going to be likely better than what Impact was for this team last year, because Impact was terrible, but the bar is in hell for what Impact in 2025 was. So as long as Morgan's not a disaster, at least he'll be able to stabilize. And then there's Jose Deodo. He really was the consolation prize, unfortunately, in the offseason for Inspired. He was either going to go to LYON or Team Liquid, whoever didn't get Inspired, and that ends up being Team Liquid. Jose's fine as a player. I watched a lot of his tape from last year. It's good. I wouldn't say it's exceptional. He was solid. He's probably about the same level as Griffin coming over from the LTA South. I think both of them played at a decently similar level in terms of how they performed. We've obviously seen Jose Deodo in the LCS before for FlyQuest for a couple of years, but he's a more improved player now. I would say he's developed a lot more, I would say, at least as a well-rounded player than maybe when he was here the first time. The problem that I have with this is just like, what was the point of bringing in Yuji? Like, why do we even do this? What a waste of time for literally everyone involved. You've absolutely screwed this guy over. You brought him up as the starting jungler to take over for You gave him half of a split, or like 2 months of gameplay. He played like 3 best of 3s into immediate playoff series, and he wasn't perfect. He had a couple of mistakes. He was an average jungler at this level, and all of a sudden Team Liquid's like, well, we got to move in a different direction. I just don't get it, man. Why even bring him in the first place? Now Yuji is teamless because he's in visa jail. He's neither NA nor EU, which means that no team actually can sign him and feel good about it. I believe he's going to Maryville. He's going to go play for Maryville in Tier 2 again. Awesome. Glad we just completely derailed Yuji's career in order to sign Jose Deodo. I get that he's taking up an import slot, and so you wouldn't be able to have Morgan, Quid, and Yuji on the same team, but that makes it even more puzzling that you bring Morgan in. Why is it not Yuji Quid as your mid-jungle duo, and then someone like Surdy, like I said, as your top laner? Like, there has to be other options towards what this ended up being. I don't want to hate on Jose Deodo as a player, because I think generally he's fine, but I think the process behind how Team Liquid handled this offseason is disastrous. Like, I really do think that they were gifted basically the best start to an offseason that you can have. You have a superstar young AD carry. You have a veteran support who's going to elevate every piece of talent that comes in around him. And you picked up the biggest prize of the offseason, arguably the second best player in the entire region in Quid as your starting mid laner, somebody who's head and shoulders above everybody else in that position. And then it just felt like you tripped and stumbled across the finish line through the rest of this roster. It's bad process. I think the team is going to struggle for it. Like this should be a top 1 roster, and I don't think they are a top 1 roster with Morgan and Jose Deodo on the top side. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I end up getting proven wrong, and Jose is excellent, and Morgan ends up, being really strong and solid, and, actually comes in and is a really, effective import, much better than someone like Umti ever was for this team. But I just don't see it with this roster. They're still going to have a chance to win the league because Quid and LYON are that good as a duo, Core as well. Like, they are that good as a trio. But I think this shouldn't have been a conversation. This should have been a team that absolutely, with Yuji and, someone else on the top side was sprinting to a real title contention. And I think they really kind of took the easy way out and ended up making their team worse because of it. Then moving on to our 6th team of the video and our guest spot team here in the LCS, as it's Disguised that we get to talk about next. They basically completely overhaul their roster, 3 of their 5 starting members going to Sentinels, one of them staying here, and the other one, of course, going to Dignitas, which we will talk about in just a little bit. But it means a real reinvention for what DSG is. It's kind of akin to what they were last year, quite frankly, going into the year, where they have a mix of veterans and young and up-and-coming players. I really am excited for what the ceiling of this team could look like if everything were to work out, but there are some roster decisions here that I am just a little bit more concerned about, at least in year 1. Certainly some roster decisions that I'm not as big of a fan of personally that I'll go ahead and talk about. It's really just one here that I'm not really a big fan of, which we will, kind of go into. But overall, I like the punt onto youth for DSG. I'm glad this guest spot is being used to elevate a lot of young talent, and I think that there is talent on this team. That I will definitely give them credit for. Their lineup is looking like Castle in the top lane, Kryra in the jungle, Call Me in the mid lane, Sajed at AD carry, and Lions at support. The only member coming back here is Castle on the top side. I think this makes sense. Castle, for most of the year, was the best player on this team. Obviously, Rahel, even Darkwings, who he kind of getting back up to speed coming in at the end of the year, really kind of elevated things. But in winter, Castle was awesome. He was like genuinely one of the better top laners in the entire league. He was consistently, really producing in lane and generating a lot of resources for himself. It's just that by the time he could really ever do anything with it, the game was entirely over because you had Abadaga in the mid lane, and there was no way you were ever going to be able to play through that. But Castle's a very talented player. He just got to watch his former teammate Imperfect make World Finals, and obviously that had to be a pretty surreal experience, but I think Castle's, general development arc should be peaking around now. He's never been consistent. He's always just kind of been an average starter, and honestly, in spring, before DSG kind of recovered, and after he kind of had that big breakout in winter, he was terrible. Like, there was a point in the middle of the year where he was really not good, and that's why he gets the B- grade alongside the fact that he is taking up an import slot. But I think the upside is definitely here. I think if you were ever going to bring, one player back, it probably would have been Rahel, but, Castle I don't think is like the worst choice. I think the only thing you're frustrated by is that he's taking up an import slot, because I think this team would have really preferred a couple other players that maybe aren't in the league right now, but we'll talk about that actually right now. Let's get into the NACL promotions before we jump into Call Me and Lions, who I'm going to be a little bit more skeptical of. Kryra and Sajed are coming up here, and for differing reasons, I'm not concerned. I love both of these players. I think they're both going to do well at the tier 1 level. I'm just surprised by both of their call-ups. First off, I love Kryra. I've been going to bat for Kryra regularly on this channel over the past couple of years in the NACL. You are never going to get me to say that Kryra is not a good choice for upside, even in tier 1. I really do think that this guy within a year could be like a really solid tier 1 tier 1 jungler, not top laner, tier 1 jungler. I do think he has that kind of mechanical and game understanding upside. Like, I think he's just really well-rounded. He's very, very active on the map, and he knows how to influence games at a professional and competitive level. My whole thing here is the only thing you can nitpick is, like, it is a little bit funny that Kryra does have a starting spot in the LCS and UG does not, right? Like, it's just one of those things where it just feels a little bit, I get it, UG's an import slot, and you can't do that because you have Castle and Call Me on this team, so Kryra ends up being the pick. But even someone like Tomio, also not having an LCS spot, like, I love Kryra, I really do, but it does always surprise me that the promotions from tier 2 are almost never like the best performing players in tier 2. It's always the players that haven't had an opportunity at tier 1 in the first place. I think Kryra is going to be a good player. I'm worried that this is not a great environment for him to debut in, and that maybe that will affect his, I don't want to say prospects long term like it has for a lot of the other players that we're going to talk about in just a second, but I love Kryra. You're not going to hear me say that Kryra is not deserving of this call-up. I think he's a great player, and I think he has the potential to be very good at this level. And then you've got Sajed in the bot lane. This one's less, I think, not out of nowhere, because Kryra was excellent for Blue Water at the end of the year. He was really great in the small stint that he had with CCG, and obviously ended up winning Tier 3 with them, or winning the ACL with them, which is a huge tournament. Like, Kryra has had his success, but Sajed is somebody who has consistently been an MVP, all-pro caliber player in Tier 2. The only thing to say here is that I kind of expected this to be Scary Jerry. I know obviously he was on this team last year and ended up getting replaced by Rahel. I always figured that was kind of temporary, and he showed everything he needed to show in Tier 2, but Sajed's probably about as good of a player in terms of, how things end up breaking down, at least in terms of current ability, and you can make the argument that he has higher potential. I really like Sajed. I think he's the kind of player that can come in and, really acclimate himself to the LCS in a way that someone like Masu did. It was a little bit of a difficult start for Masu, but he had the kind of surrounding core that allowed him to, as I've said a couple of times here, make those mistakes that, allow him to grow into the role that he needed to be for that team. I'm not sure Sajed has that same surrounding core. I think he's going to be asked to do a lot day number 1, but he's a good player. He's just somebody that you never really know how these kinds of players are going to perform. Do I think he's as good of a prospect as Scary Jerry was last year? To me, no. It's close. It's very close. I think they're decently similar players, but I think Jerry had more of a, progression upside. I think Sajed has just kind of been really good, and he did get better this past year, but I don't know if I'm expecting him to come in and be like a top, 4 or 5 AD carry. And if he's not top 4 or 5, then he's going to be losing a lot. And if that's the case, you just have to hope that this team has more patience than they did with Jerry. And they likely won't. They have a guest spot that they have to maintain. If he's not performing well day number 1, he's likely not going to be able to stick around for the long haul. That's going to be the same case for Kryra in the jungle as well. It's why I am a little bit concerned for this team. The leash on these players is going to be much smaller than it is for other orgs that can afford to go 8th. DSG cannot afford to go 8th. They're going to be in the NACL, or they're going to be gone from League of Legends if they go 8th. So it's just one of those things where I hope these players are given the time they need to get used to this level. I don't think they're slam dunk prospects. If this was Tomio and if this was, Scary Jerry, I think I'd feel a little bit more okay, I kind of understand where we're going for here. These are players that have a little bit of Tier 1 experience, but really honed their stuff in Tier 2 last year and have kind of proven they deserve another shot. Kryra and Sajed are bigger risks. They have higher upside, I think, than those two players do, but they have lower floors for sure. So we'll see how that ends up breaking down. Both of those are going to be a change as well. For what it's worth, I think Kryra might be at the bare minimum just as good as XU was last year. I think they're pretty similar in terms of current ability. Sajed is obviously not Rahel, but he should theoretically give you, similar upside to the performance that Rahel gave you at the end of the year. And then there's the young player veterans. I don't know how to talk about this. LYON's obviously somebody who's been to Worlds multiple times and was on LYON last year. This is the most confusing roster decision for me over the course of this entire offseason. I don't really get it. I don't get why this isn't Zyko. You're bringing up Sajed, you might as well bring up his support with him. Zyko has deserved a call-up for such a long time to the LCS, and it really did feel like this was going to be the roster that could really push that youth. When I saw that Kryra and Sajed had joined, I felt really, confident, and, I had a lot of expectation that this was going to be a Tier 2 support that had performed really well, whether it was Zyko or Breezy or somebody who's kind of just been stuck in the system for a very long time. Zazel even on this team, but LYON's just doesn't inspire that same level of confidence in me. This guy was a below average support last year. At times he was awful. At times he was okay. I think that there were moments where he looked passable, but for the most part, he had a ton of really bad moments for that LYON team. And also, I don't really ever expect it to get better. His mechanical ceiling is just not all that high. He does a lot of the little things well, but he does a lot of the big things really poorly. He's not a great fighter at grubs. He's not a good skirmisher. He's really not all that great of a laner. This is a downgrade for me. I think you are getting worse going from even who he was last year, which for a majority of the year was not a particularly productive support to someone like LYON's. I think that's worse, and he, for me, is going to get a C grade. He's the lowest rated player alongside Cryogen, but, Cryogen's never played a game at Tier 1. He should B going up. Like, Cryogen's the kind of player that you hope would be a B or a B- by the end of the year. LYON's, I think, is just a C-graded support. He's just not somebody that I feel particularly good about. And again, if this were Zyko or if this were any other tier 2 support, I think I would just feel a lot better about this circumstance, but it's not. Now you have Sajed that has a lot of responsibility to, kind of step up and carry games here, and he's got a support that I just don't think is going to help him do that. The final player to talk about here is Calmy in the mid lane. Calmy's a really interesting player because he was awesome at the tier 2 level, and just like every Nongshim tier 2 mid laner, he goes up to tier 1 and gets absolutely toasted. It happened to Fiesta, it happened to Fisher, like, it's happening to, it might happen to Calyx. Who knows, man? Calyx was decent, but at least he had a couple of moments. Calmy is just, he's a hard projection, right? Because you go and watch how he performed in tier 2 last year, in the ERLs last year, especially at EMEA Masters last year, and he was really good at that tournament. I think him and Mihail were both a really good, kind of solo lane duo, and both kind of showed that mechanically speaking, they were just better than a lot of the players they were playing into, but he doesn't have that killer instinct for me. He's kind of being brought in here to be a star player. Like, when you really think about the way that this is constructed, you're not necessarily expecting Kryra or Sajed to be that day one. Calmy kind of has the best chance to be the player that you can play through day number one, because you don't really want to do that with Castle on the top side, and if that's what you're kind of bringing Calmy in for, I think that that's a really big expectation for him. This is yet another circumstance where, as much as I do like Calmy, and I really think this is an okay import, I think you could have gotten a similar performance from a tier 2 player. Again, I'm not going to continue to harp on it, but like, there are players like Insanity that I think have higher floors than Calmy if you want to try and bridge that gap a little bit more. And there's even, players like Toasty that I think have significantly more upside, in my opinion, than someone like Calmy does. It just kind of feels like this is the middle ground decision, and the middle ground decision almost never really works out for a lot of these teams. So I'm going to be honest, I'm not as much of a fan of this offseason as maybe some others are. I'm really excited to see players like Kryra and Sajed in the LCS, but I'm worried that this is a team that's going to go 8th, right? Like, they're going to go 8th and split number 1 in winter, and they're not going to be very good throughout most of spring, and then they're going to do exactly what they did last year, which is get rid of the rookies so that they can be good enough to maintain their spot in tier 1, and then it was all going to be for nothing. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that does not end up being the case, but there is a real fear and concern in me that that could be what 2026 looks like again. But then moving on to our 7th team, and boy, I really buried the lead on this video, didn't I? You have to wait till basically an hour in to get to the team that everyone wants to hear everyone talk about. It's LYON coming in at the 7th spot from last year, second to last, and something tells me they're not going to be second to last going into 2026. This is a team that, won the offseason for a lot of people, that absolutely ended up, taking all the headlines. They got inspired, and then the domino effect, they bring back Berserker, they, build around Saint. Zamudo finally gets to play, Isles comes in, which we'll talk about. This team is undoubtedly better than what they were last year, and obviously I'm really excited to see what they're going to be able to do in 2026. But I do want to put some reservation maybe on the hype train that seems to be getting a bit out of control for this team. If you want to sit here and say that they are, projected to be the best team in the league, I think that that's a fair thing. If you want to say that it's like guaranteed that there's no one close to them, that's where I disagree. There's a lot that could go wrong for this team in terms of how they are constructed. They certainly are not a super team in the sense of the word. They are, a team full of either players that have experienced success, most of their career, if not all of it. Like, Inspired obviously is, just been good, but Berserker coming off of, a down year for everybody on the DN Freaks. You have someone like Saint, who, while he's had some incredible games, has also been inconsistent in a lot of ways. Zamudo, who's never played in tier 1, and Isles, who's not really like a star at this level. This is not a guaranteed top 1 team by any stretch of the imagination. I don't even know if they're going to end number 1 in my power rankings. I'm going to be entirely frank about that. But now that the pessimism is out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about the good. First off, you're building around Saint. He is your franchise player. You brought him in last year when you got to join the LTA, and now you get to keep him as you join the LCS, and it's the right call. Saint was the only player on this team that was worth building around. Surdy, I would love to see him get another shot, but Zamudo, you picked him up midway through the year because you wanted him to be your starting top laner, and obviously visa complications just made it a little bit too tough. He gets to play now. I'm certainly not mad about, Zamudo coming in, but Saint is the guy that you are building around here for LYON. And I'm so excited to see if this is going to be the year that he becomes everything that everybody wants him to be, because last year, boy, the Flashes looked good. I think he got 2 or 3 different player of the weeks for me, but he also got 2 dud of the weeks for me throughout a lot of last year, which I don't think a lot of people remember. People kind of look at Saints 2025 with some rose-colored glasses, I think, for the most part, but he was inconsistent. There were some great moments, but when it really mattered, he kind of shut down. Like, he was not good enough to get this team into the playoffs, and really, when you go and watch that series, that ended up being that playoff qualifier, not only were they favorites going into that, which people forget about, but Saint was easily the worst player on the Rift. Like, he was absolutely disastrous in a pretty big moment for the team, and it was coming off of a couple of games where he wasn't very good in those either. Like, it just really, there's a lot of ups and downs right now with Saint, and the talent is clear. Like, it is very obvious that this guy is good enough to be the best mid laner in North America from a talent perspective. We've seen it on a week-to-week basis where you can have one week where he plays 3 games and he just obliterates all of them. But in the same vein, like, if he's going to have those bad games, he just can't be considered, you know, a consistent player. I think that it is likely that he breaks out this year, that he is an all-pro caliber mid laner, that he's somebody who competes to, you know, try and win MVP, or at the very least is in like the conversation on a team like this. But I just can't rank him as such coming out of 2025, because I think I still need to see that, you know, promise come to fruition. Right now, it's still potential. The potential has been partly realized, but he's not all that different from what we saw in the Challengers League right now, and he needs to get better than that in order to be the best mid laner in the league. But absolutely, should you build around Saint? Definitely. He showed you more than enough year 1 to feel comfortable building around him, and clearly it was enough to attract Inspired to come to this team. It really felt like Inspired was going to choose Team Liquid for a lot of the offseason, at least for a lot of the beginning of the offseason, but he picks LYON, I presume because he wants to play with Saint. I can't imagine the numbers were all that different in the contracts from those two teams. I can't imagine Team Liquid just purely got outbid, but Inspired, you know, coming over here to LYON is like a complete franchise-altering type of move. He's the only A+ in this video. It's obviously an upgrade over ODLAN. Like, this is the biggest upgrade in the entire video. This is a super upgrade. Like, you're getting the best player in the league here as your starting jungler, and if there was ever a thing that made me comfortable to say that Saint is likely going to reach his potential, it's bringing in a player like Inspired. He does everything at an elite level. He's obviously an elite team fighter. That's really where he's going to make the big bucks, is, you know, in those 5v5s, whether he's playing tanks or carries. He's just unbelievably good in the later parts of the game. The early games for him used to be exploitable back in Europe, and really when he first came over for Evil Geniuses here in North America, but he has cleaned that up to an astounding degree, and he has just become the most well-rounded jungler in the West. He's become the best player in the West, in my opinion, at least as of the beginning of 2026. Who knows if that will last, but in 2025, he was the best player in the West, and I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to keep it up. This guy has basically never done anything other than dominate, like at every level of competition he's played at, so I have a feeling he's going to be just fine. This is the biggest possible win that LYON could get, and they weren't stopping there. I mean, they go out and get Berserker in the AD carry role. Berserker obviously had a very weird 2025. He goes back to the LCK after, you know, a couple of good years on Cloud9. He had great years at the start of his Cloud9 tenure. It looked like he was going to be one of the better AD carries in the world, and then, you know, the last year on C9, it looked a little bit more up and down. It never really felt like it clicked in the way that maybe he wanted it to. Goes back to the LCK and looks good for a little bit on a team that's just a disaster, and then it's clear like his mental just shattered alongside the rest of the DN Freaks at the end of 2025. Hopefully he's going to be able to come back to North America, where he's found the most amount of success in his career, and be able to pick up where he left off at his best with Cloud9. But even the Berserker that left like the LCS was probably not like a top 1 kind of AD carry in North America, like at least the last time that we saw him. You're just hopeful that you can get the best version of Berserker back. I have some reservations. I think alongside the fact that he's an import, you know, A- feels like the best I can give him right now. He was not an A- caliber player last year in terms of how he ended up performing. Obviously in the LCK, he probably would be closer to a B or a B- over in the LCK. That's just kind of the difference in the value of these players in these grades. But in terms of North America, especially with this surrounding core, I have a feeling he's going to be one of the more productive players. And again, another MVP candidate, somebody who's already won an MVP, I believe, here in North America. The next player I want to talk about, we'll get to Isles last, is Zamudo on the top side. Glad they stuck with him. A really shitty situation last year where he just wasn't able to actually get his visa and come in and play for LYON after getting signed by them, so he had to go and play in Latin America. Definitely a frustrating turn of events, but I'm really glad to see that they stuck with him, even though they are in win now mode on this roster. Like, bringing in Inspired, bringing in Berserker, you feel comfortable enough to go with Zamudo. Do I think Zamudo is guaranteed to be a superstar day number one? No. I do think Zamudo actually has a pretty relatively low floor in terms of how his performances can go. Remember, this was a guy who was inconsistent, to say the least, before he joined Maryville, before he joined Dragonsteel down in the NACL, and then, of course, he just kind of exploded from there. Year number one, he was protected a lot by UG, but generally was still very good, even if he was kind of strong side every single game for that team. And then year number two, he was just dominating everybody. Last year in 2025, he just absolutely decimated everybody that he went into, so much so that he got the mid-year call-up. Hopefully that version of him is still there. Hopefully he learned a lot on Maryville and can now translate that success into Tier 1 play, but my biggest concern with Zamudo, and I talked about this last year when I talked about the promotion, is that he's never at any point in his career played without being like the main character of his team, if you will, without a lot of the resources going towards his side of the map. That will not happen on this team. Like, it's just not. He is going to play weak side in a majority of their games, I would have to imagine, and I don't know if he's going to be like a superstar in that role. I hope he can be. I hope he's good enough mechanically to just be able to win 1v1 if left isolated in those matchups, but it's just not guaranteed, right? Like, I need to see it before I just blindly believe it. It's the same thing with Saint, right? I think Zamudo's upside is ridiculous because of his mechanical talent, but I think his floor is lower than someone like Surtees, who came in last year. I think Surtee has a more well-rounded game, whereas I think Zamudo's upside is maybe a tad bit higher, although I'm just such a big fan of Surtee. I think that guy could be the best top laner in North America if given a real opportunity. But Zamudo's not far off from that either. Both of them are in good spots. And then for Isles, the final player to talk about here, if there is a concern with this team, it's Isles in the support position. This just feels like a weird signing to me. It's reported that this was the decision of the LYON players, that they wanted Isles, that he was the support that they felt the most comfortable with. This still is an upgrade because LYONs is just not a good player, so Isles coming in, even being like a below average starter at this level, is still good enough. But C+ on a team that wants to try to win the LCS is just not a good look. Like, I don't know. Isles has always just been the same kind of player. There was one split, I think you can point to, I believe it was 2023 spring. That year he was on Dignitas with Tomo, not this past year, but the first time he was on Dignitas with Tomo, and that bot lane 2v2 was just really good. In a league where a lot of the 2v2s were very passive and wanted to play for late game, it was LYON and Core, and it was Isles and Tomo that were actually like stepping up and really, generating leads for themselves. Ever since then, he's just kind of been the 7th best support in the league, like no matter what, whether it's on a super team with other Dignitas players like Jensen and Sven and Spica and Licorice, like that version, or whether it was last year on a Dignitas team that was not in the same spot. He's just never been anything other than a below average support at this level, and there's no real reason to believe he's going to be any different. Here, I think performance-wise, it's likely going to look better than it actually is, but I don't know, when you're talking about international success or even like winning the LCS type of hopes and desires, there are a lot of question marks on this team. You feel great about Inspired, and I feel pretty good that Berserker is just going to be good again coming back to North America, although it's certainly not guaranteed. I even feel pretty good about Saint kind of making that leap and getting into the A- category by the end of the year. Is Zamudo going to be good enough on weak side to be able to feel comfortable to do all the things he did at the tier 2 level? And can Isles be good enough to actually be the kind of support that wins the LCS? Those are the major question marks for LYON. I certainly think this team got infinitely better and they completely changed the outlook and the overall fortune of this organization, but to say that they are like runaway favorites for the LCS, I think might be a little bit disingenuous to just where this team is at. But that's going to bring us to our 8th and final team of the video, and it's a team that I think a lot of people had, some weird expectations for. There was new management coming in for this organization, but I'm really not sure how it ended up turning out. It's Dignitas coming in as our final team of the video. It's clear that Jonathan is in charge now that the NRG, CLG, GM, and just overall, management staff has come in. It's clear that that is the direction they want to go, and Palafox, FBI, and Ignar are reunited from that quarterfinals NRG team from 2023. Do I think they'll have the same kind of success here in 2026? I have no idea. I genuinely could not begin to tell you whether or not that's going to be the case. I'll give my reasons why I'm a little bit more pessimistic about maybe some of these signings and about this team in general. I don't quite know the direction they're going in, but I've been proven wrong with this management team before, so hopefully that happens again. Their lineup is looking like Photon in the top lane, XU in the jungle, Palafox in the mid lane, FBI at AD carry, and Ignar at support. Only member staying from Dignitas last year is Photon, and he was a mid-year addition in the top lane, obviously replacing Surdy. He came in to hopefully upgrade the potential of this team, and you know what? He was kind of everything that he was supposed to be in terms of how he ended up, coming into the LCS. He was really good in lane, and his team was terrible, so he didn't really get to do anything. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say that Photon was a superstar, but I didn't see anything that made me think less of Photon after watching him play for Dig in 2025. He had such a small runtime in terms of how many games this team ended up getting and just how much time he had to acclimate himself. He's really mechanically talented. Like, this guy is truly one of the best laners, full stop, in the entire league, regardless of position. He is able to generate a lot of advantages on his own, and I think especially in a position like top lane that really is not all that consistent. Like, is he the second best top laner in the league? I think that there's like a real argument that that is the case. It's like him and Fudge and, players of that caliber that are fighting it out. And obviously you hope that players like Zamudo could theoretically enter that, conversation. Maybe someone like Morgan enters that conversation. But Photon, for me, I think has a real, shot at being like a top 2 top laner basically from day number 1, just off of his mechanics alone. I've always been a fan of him going back to the T1 Challengers days, and then obviously on Vitality, I gave him my MVP for that winter split in 2023. This is just one of those players that I think in the right environment is going to look like a star. In the wrong environment is not really going to be able to change the outcome of games because he's a top laner that isn't particularly, macro-oriented. He's much more micro-oriented, but if he is on a good team, he's going to look phenomenal. I think mechanically speaking, this guy is everything that you want, and hopefully, with a better team around him now, he has more success going into 2026. As for the rest of this team, let's get the energy out of the way first, both the excitement and the NRG of it all. We'll talk about Palafox, FBI, and Ignar all kind of as like a trio because they're all being brought in for similar reasons. FBI is definitely the most positive change. I think here this is just an upgrade in the bot lane. Tomo never really lived up to what I thought his potential could be, which is, a really stable AD carry at this level that was very good in lane. It really felt like he started off his LCS career with that kind of promise where he was, really aggressive in the 2v2s and was always going to step up. I kind of called him baby Jackie Love in a lot of instances because I think he had that very similar kind of play style. He just obviously didn't have the mechanics that, a lot of the top tier players at this level did, and he never really was able to kind of reiterate on that success that he had early on in his career. But FBI is about as stable as you can possibly get in the AD carry role. He's really become a jack of all trades kind of player. I compared him to Ductum a lot throughout Worlds and just throughout a lot of last year. I think they're very similar players in the way that they play the game. FBI is the kind of player who is going to be good in the early game. He's going to be good in the late game. He's not really going to make mistakes. He's pretty mentally sound. There can be times where he can hyper carry, but you typically want to play around other lanes. We saw in winter of last year that he can really dominate the 2v2 in the right circumstance, but for the most part in 2025, he really settled into just being a really good AD carry. The definition of a B to B plus type of player that you feel good about having, but isn't necessarily a star. I think he's a great complement to someone like Photon on this team because Photon is going to generate and draw so much pressure onto the top side of the map. Having a player like FBI that's going to be a bit more comfortable either playing weak side so that you can play more for the top side of the map, or alternatively being able to kind of take advantage of the fact that resources are being pulled elsewhere by the enemy team and utilizing his 2v2 prowess to win. I think FBI is a very good fit alongside a player like Photon, and I think this is a good pickup for Dignitas, and this is kind of the one NRG player that I feel really good about. Then you have Ignar, his bot lane partner. I have no clue what you're going to get out of Ignar. I mean, the last time we saw him play was for Giant X over in the LEC. Before that, it was just the energy days. He didn't play at all last year. I have no clue where he is at in terms of his skill. He was fine for Giant X. Like, he wasn't the biggest problem in the world, but that team also wasn't particularly exciting in the way that they played the game. B- I think is an average ranking for him. I think C+ would have been relatively fair for a player like Ignar, especially because he still is taking up an import slot on this team, which likely did matter for some of the other positions they wanted to go for. Again, this could have been another UG spot if, you weren't using your import slots on both Photon and Ignar, but I don't know, man. It's hard for me to get really excited about picking up a player who didn't even have a team last year. Like, it just is not one of those scenarios that makes me ultra excited. I like Ignar, and I like, obviously, the track record that he's had as a player. He's basically won, almost everywhere he's gone in North America. You have the FlyQuest teams. You have, obviously, the NRG teams. like he's had success at this level. It's just I don't know. Like what is he supposed to come in and be like a top 4 support for this team? I feel like that's very unlikely. Is he better than Isles? The last time we saw him play, he was better than Isles. I think that that's a fair thing to say. But again, I didn't see him play at all last year. I don't know what kind of form he's in, and a lot can change in a year. He's a gigantic question mark for this team. If he can come in and actually be like a borderline top 4, top half kind of support, and FBI and Ignar can get back to how they were playing for Energy in 2023, many moons ago, then all of a sudden I think things do actually change in terms of an outlook for this team. But, you know, I'm kind of betting against that. I think Ignar is going to be kind of what Ole was when he came back into the league a couple of years ago, where it's just like, yeah, man, you're okay. You're fine. Like, it's just, he's probably going to be the 5th to 6th best support in the league, and it's not going to be particularly impressive. And I hope I'm wrong. Like, I hope that that doesn't end up being the case. And then you have Palafox in the mid lane. What an interesting, you know, buy-in, because this is like a buy low from him, or from Dignitas onto Palafox. They buy low a lot. I don't think Palafox was better than Kana last year for a majority of the year. I do think he was better when it mattered, and I think that that is certainly something to take into account. Palafox was completely running it down for a majority of 2025 until it, you know, came down to him beating Cloud9 and getting his team to the LTA championships, like the cross-conference championships. That's where he started to play some of the best league he's played all year long, and it probably got him a job here on Energy. But I hate to say it, this is clearly a nepotism hire. Ignar is a nepotism hire, and I think Palafox is a nepotism hire. Jonathan really trusts his guys, and, you know, maybe he sees something in Palafox's game that is more replicable than what we saw last year, but you know, what we saw was a player that had taken a lot of the patience and the controlled chaos that he was really good at his, you know, in his prime on CLG and, you know, on those NRG teams, and, you know, basically threw that all out to just flip games at level 4. That was the kind of version of Palafox that we got last year. If Jonathan and if this organization feels like they can tap back into, you know, reeling him in and reining him in a bit to allow his mechanics to shine without, you know, allowing him to be so volatile. Obviously, Palafox has been a very productive mid laner at this level before for a considerable amount of time, and that's why he's a C+ and not a C. I think he performed closer to being like a C or a C, you know, barely a C+ last year, but I trust the track record of Palafox, and, you know, if he's going to be able to play closer to 2023, 2020, even 2022, like Palafox, who I was really going to bat for, I think that player is valuable. I think that that would be an addition to this team, and he would be better than Kana, and, you know, Dig would have a much better season. I just need to kind of feel comfortable that you are actually getting that out of this player before I say it, because the last time we saw him, it just was not very good. Again, buying low on a player that has shown good things in the past. And then finally, you have XU in the jungle. Very funny to see XU come back to Dignitas after everything he said about the organization, but as he stated in his tweet about it, this org is very different now than it was when it, you know, kind of screwed over XU a couple of years ago. Still definitely fun to see him kind of become a Dignitas staple against his own will. But XU is an interesting pickup here. I like XU, but boy, was he kind of exposed for a majority of last year. It really did feel like the biggest worry that I had about him and his playstyle kind of came to fruition in 2025, which is to say that he was really valuable in Tier 2 when he had winning lanes, when he had laners that could generate advantages for him to be able to play a bit more aggressive. When he didn't have that in 2025, things were bad. Like he looked bad for the majority of the year. I think winter and spring and even the beginning of summer, I think it's pretty easy to say that he was the weakest jungler in the LCS. Things got better towards the end of the split when everybody on Disguise kind of got more comfortable, when Rahel started playing better, when Darkwings came in and really stabilized in the mid lane, and then obviously he was pretty good in the promotion tournament to get DSG back. But I do think this is a gamble. I would have rather had Shaden on this team, and I don't know, again, I know Shaden has some off the rift stuff. I have no clue if that played into it at all, but I would have rather kept Shaden and played like, maybe Shaden and Palafox is not the way to go. I have no clue, right? Like, but, you know, even just kind of thinking about that now, but XU's just not someone who particularly excites me right now. I hope he proves me wrong, because I really did like him a lot in Tier 2, and I think this guy, you know, a couple of years ago was really looked at by me and by a lot of people as a top tier jungle prospect. It just has not really worked out up until this point. I think he could be a weak link for the team, and you know what? Palafox and Ignar could be right there with him. I think that there is a very real chance this team goes fast 8th, and that this just does not work out, that Photon is up 200 gold on average on the top side and none of it matters. I think FBI is relatively stable, but you need 3 players on this team to perform better than what the expectations are. XU, Palafox, and Ignar all need to be better than either they were last year or than, you know, what the expectation is for someone like Ignar, who didn't even play last year. There is a lot riding on some risks here for Dignitas. I really thought this org was going to invest more into young talent. That to me was the takeaway from NRG, not the fact that, Palafox, FBI, and Ignar were good, but rather that it was a team that invested itself into players like Dokla and Contracts and Palafox that were overlooked by a lot of other teams because they weren't established at the tier 1 level. It looks like the takeaway instead was just the individual players. I hope that Dig ends up performing well, but I'd be lying if I said my expectations were high. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCS 2026 roster and off-season grades video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. Obviously, these are very controversial, very divisive videos. I'm sure you've already left a comment about the thing that you love or the thing that you hate that I said. I'm sure I'm rating someone too high, specifically like a Cloud9, or I'm not harsh enough on the imports or whatever you want me to say. Let me know what that is down in the comments. Like I said at the beginning of the video, let me know what your favorite grade was and what your least favorite grade of the video was, and generally just how you feel in comparison to me on a lot of these teams. Again, very curious to know the general consensus thoughts and opinions down below. Do want to make a small announcement. I will be back for LPL English throughout basically all of this year. Obviously I don't have any specific dates to plug just yet, but Demacia Cup is coming up, the preseason tournament for the LPL, and I will be a part of that at least a little bit. We'll let you know further details on that once I know. Follow my Twitter down in the description if you want a more updated, I guess, time frame of that. I will probably tweet out when I am going to be casting for them, but I'll be around on the LPL English broadcast all year long, so definitely go ahead and subscribe to both the YouTube and the Twitch. Links to that are in the description, but also like the video. It really does help. Obviously, these are very divisive videos, like I said, and so there's going to be a lot of dislikes. Generally, there's going to be a lot of, comments that disagree with me. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really helps me a lot in the algorithm and helps get this video out to a lot more people. Hit subscribe as well. We posted the LEC version of this video, which you can check out. The LCK and the LPL versions are going to be coming out very shortly in terms of talking about those teams. We're just waiting for all of the teams to officially wrap up their off seasons there before we jump in to every single roster, but we're going to be going over everything as we always do. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all